Hello and welcome to another episode of The Future of, where I'm joined by visionaries and thought leaders from diverse backgrounds and industries as we dissect the sectors into layers, understand its evolution, and crystal ball gaze on where it is headed and what the future holds. Today, we are joined by Chris Butler, lead product manager with Google and part of the latest list of ones to watch in PLG by Product Marketing Alliance. Welcome to the show, Chris. How are you doing?
Great. Thank you for having me here. I'm really excited to talk to you and to your audience.
Yeah, likewise. So you've had great product experience. So I'm really thrilled to have you on the show to discuss the future of product and product-led growth. And before we jump into discussing the future of product-led growth, around for the audience as well. So you've led and been part of product teams at Google, Microsoft, Facebook, Cognizant, Kayak, and Waze, to name a few. So talk to me about how you got into product function and how has this unfolded for you over the last few years?
Yeah, absolutely. If we want to go back far enough, I actually was maybe going to get into design. My dad was a art director and graphic designer, and at the time I was apprenticing to him in middle school and high school. And his dream for me was to actually be an automotive designer. But then I guess as much as I enjoyed doing the art and kind of design side of things, a lot of it was inside of how do we take this very foundational way of building graphic design using printouts and spray adhesive and X-Acto knives and turn that into something that is based on the computer. And I started building web pages for some of his clients when I was in high school. And it just seemed like going into something like engineering was going to be a better kind of match for the types of creativity that I really enjoyed, which was programming and electronics and stuff like that. And ended up doing an engineering degree in college and a computer systems engineering degree. So it was in between the idea of like hardware and designing microchips and the idea of software design. But when I started interviewing at different places coming out of college, I'd get job offers from places that would do like secure radio communication, or there seemed to be like a lot of security stuff related, but it was always engineering related things, except for one place actually put me for some reason on a program management track interview for Microsoft. And so the thing that was most interesting to me was during one of the interviews, they asked for me to design a washer dryer combination for someone that was sight impaired. And so I think I was drawn to this idea of just understanding how people would deal with the world and how the kind of way we end up building things actually impacts them a lot. And so a lot of the work that I was doing was probably helpful in my senior year because a lot of it was very project-based work where we were trying to figure out like we would build a game or we'd build a plan for a game, or we would do all these things that were really more along the lines of almost project management. But I think a lot of people, the gateway into product management is through project management. And so I ended up getting hired as a program manager at Microsoft. And at the time, we were still doing things that were very project-y. So I was building like project charts with Gantt chart style, but also trying to think about who's the customer, how do we segment them, how we solve their problems, things like that. And so that was where I got started. I got started right out of school, which I think it was more rare at the time to do that with product management. So since then, fast forward, I've done a lot of different types of roles. I've worked as a business development person, a hybrid BD and product roles. I've done tech evangelism or kind of tech evangelism plus product roles, but I've never really gotten that far away from product management. And really what I see is being the most important thing about product management is really this like embracing and understanding and helping the team manage or understand the uncertainty of the world. And I think the other aspect is really just about decision making. And so I've been doing a lot of work recently. I'm actually going to be presenting next week at the Product Operations Summit that the PLA did. Mostly about my talk's title is Deciding How to Decide. And I think a lot of it just in general, how do we help teams to be as effective as possible? And that's why I'd say the last couple of roles I've had have been very focused on the effectiveness of product managers specifically, but also just how teams work with each other. And that's part of the reason why I was in the PLG, like ones to watch, was just like my focus on how do we build great teams and how do product managers continue to not only hone their ability to do their craft, but also just do a great job of working with the various people inside of their group. And so that's where I'm at today. But yeah, like you said, I'm at Google now as a lead product manager in the core machine learning group, which is really everything to do with machine learning that Google works on, both for internal and external party. But my role is mostly focused on one, helping corral and figure out the strategy for our larger team, and then PM the PM experience. So focused on figuring out a lot of one-on-one help with product managers, which could almost be
Right.
seen as like coaching. But then also this idea of moving over and figuring out what are some processes that we should be building or systems that we should be building to allow for everybody to like work better together. So that's bringing you to today.
Yeah. And especially considering the wide experience that you have had in product and now almost shaping what those product teams also do
Yeah.
and what sort of project should they be leading. From your vantage point, how have you seen the function of product in itself, which includes product development, product marketing, product growth, evolve over the
Yeah.
past few years?
I think the thing that's interesting about product-led growth for me is that it's trying to actually bring everything together so that it's no longer that there's like a marketing group or a communication group, but it's that product itself should help engage with the customers in some way that is meaningful. And that part of your marketing is actually by way of how do people first come across your product in some way? And how do they get a better chance to be able to now get into the pipeline of becoming a better customer rather than assuming that it's some other person's job to sell the product first and then start to use. And there's of course, I think like PLG hasn't really gotten as in depth with say like B2B type products today, but I think that's one of the things is trying to be more holistic about the way we consider all of the aspects of the product being integrated together. I'd also say that there's been a better distinction between what I'll call product management mentalities and project management mentalities. And so I think of these things as being on a spectrum, right? And so on one side, you have project management, which again, at Microsoft, the program manager position very early on was the combination of these. Now, I think there's a lot of anti-patterns that start to happen because of the combination of that role. I'll get back to that in a second, but I think the distinction for me about project management is really about this idea of risk reduction, or how is it that we avoid making the same mistake over and over again? How do we use systems to actually ensure that we're going to do better with the process in some way? I see product managers as being more focused on innovation and uncertainty, and really in some of that abductive thinking, which is different from inductive and deductive thinking in the sense that you find a little bit of evidence and you have to make a abductive leap towards where you think you should go. And so it's this like idea of planning, roadmap. I'll call it all speculative fiction, right? All of these things are just fictions in some way. But I think doing that is very interesting. And then working with project managers, and it's never one or the other, right? Like it's always across the spectrum that we need to work together. And different types of companies will be on different sides of this range. So things that may be more heavily regulated, require more compliance, and things like that will be on the project side where we have a lot of systems that help keep us safe, right? But then there's other things where you're first getting started and trying to figure out like what to do. You want to be like fully embracing the uncertainty and not allowing process to slow you down as much. And so I think that spectrum is really interesting. And what I would then also argue is that having two different people doing those two jobs is really valuable because there's this Conway's law, which is really just about like the way an organization is set up is the way that you'll end up shipping things, and vice versa. Like when you do talk about communicating what you do, you can actually start to shift the way people perceive your organization based on how you communicate, but it's very hard to communicate wholly differently than the way you're organized. And so the reason because of that is because there's people inside of hierarchies, because most teams still work within hierarchies, where there's a natural alignment point at a singular person, because you can't be like two different people. It's very hard to hold two kind of opposing views and not choosing one of them when you're an individual. And so I think this like otherness, or this idea of building very healthy tensions within teams, helps build a better practice around making good decisions as well. So that kind of tension between project and product management is very important to have. I say the same thing happens with like product managers and engineers, or product managers and designers, and vice versa, designers and engineers, right? Like all these different teams, you're trying to build some type of tension. And so I think more respect for that type of tension and cross-functional capability is something that is, I think, moved on and evolved over the last while that I've been doing this role. And I hope that it gets even further, because there's been some chatter I've seen online about, do we actually need a product manager role? And I don't know what we want to call it, but there needs to be someone that is actually focused on being very customer focused, being concerned about the way we end up making decisions. And that is very different than the engineering mindset, which is we want to build something that is maintainable, is able to continue on into the future in some way, and then we can continue to add new features to it. Like that is a very engineering trying to understanding of things. So I think like that tension is something that's interesting to me as like we progress. And holacracy and other types of self-organizing systems think a lot about that type of. I don't think we're going to get to fully non-hierarchical systems anytime soon for most organizations, but there's something really valuable in what we can learn about the way that, say, holacracy systems do a lot of processing around governance and tensions and things like that. So I think that's like a very interesting aspect to me. And that's why I think so much about like decision making is even within Google, right? Google is a very consensus driven culture when it comes to decision making, but that's not always the most efficient way to do things. And I'd say it's rarely the most efficient way to do things. And so that idea of considering who actually needs to be part of the discourse around a decision and then who makes the decision are different groups of people potentially. And it's valuable to say that engineering is going to make certain types of decisions and product is going to make other types of decisions. And that tension still allows for feedback and discourse, but it definitely, I think, focuses in on who's the best person to actually make a judgment call here. And so I think those are all things that, at least when I think about the work that I do most of the time, it tends to be about those things: decision-making capabilities, how do we communicate with each other, what are the tensions that we're building into our teams? And that could be also within product. I think the idea of tension within a product team is really important because before, like very early on, we would have different kind of teams based on the channel by which someone would come to our product. So we'd have a web team, a mobile web team, a mobile app team, et cetera. But that wasn't very helpful. And the reason why is because people would use all of those channels to be able to interact with something. And so that's why then people started to move on to either kind of persona or customer or even job to be done kind of organizational approaches. And those are much better because they provide a tension between different types of job to be done that will usually have different people worrying about those things. But then you'll have the alignment within that team where we're going to be hyper focused on how does this like end-to-end job to be done? How does that work actually? That's another aspect that I think is going to be progressing over time. Still in the nascent space, but I think like even just talking or thinking about these issues is something that we wouldn't have done when I first got started in my career.
Yeah. And it's a very intriguing way to look at it as a spectrum, because from what I can see outside looking in, obviously, like you said, it started out as just project management, and then different branches of it converting into product management, product marketing. And given how many marketing, project, product, sales, support silos exist in businesses these days, who is responsible for adopting and driving PLG as a strategy? You're responsible to drive the culture of growth in itself.
Yeah, I think this is something that product people in general. Now, there is a distinction today in that there's a specialization from the standpoint of product manager versus product marketing manager. And I see that as trying to be, it's almost like a DevOps role between dev and operation. Now there's like product management, product marketing management, and like pure marketing. And so I think there's a valuable thing here, which is thinking about not only how will people find the thing, but how do we get more and more people in there? And what are the ways that you do that? I see that as product marketing manager type of role. But I think the concepts of, say, like growth flywheels is something that product managers should be very intimately aware of and should actually be part of the way that they think about strategy. Because a lot of products today work much better when there's more people on the platform in some ways. There are some cases where like adverse effects start to happen when you're connected to all 6 billion people on the planet, like Facebook or something like that. There's bigger and different problems that come up there. But usually when it comes to, say, like a marketplace type of product, right? If it's a two-sided marketplace where, say, like the idea of like a car share ride type of thing, you need providers and you need consumers. And if you have an unbalance in those things, you end up creating a product that's not helpful to one of those groups, right? And actually ends up being unhelpful to both groups. And so that idea of like growth is really important in those particular cases. And so I'd say marketplaces you could talk about the idea of even like cases where there are, say, social networks that end up selling attention to other people. This business model is mostly like a three-party marketplace where it's actually like attention and money and access that end up being in this like multiple transaction in some way. And PLG, if we think about it from the standpoint of we're holistically understanding how people get to our product, stay part of our product, and then invite other people to our product, right, in some way, I think it becomes really that product manager's job. And I think that's probably the way I think about those things. I would be remiss to not include like all of these other types of safety issues, right? There's a lot of products and functionality that's coming out now, especially based on machine learning, that I think will have a huge impact on the way that people actually work in the world, interact with other human beings. And not only do we need to be more aware or understand what our values are as an organization so we can make better value-based judgments in those cases, but also just like what are restrictions or regulations we need to adhere to, because especially when it comes to like privacy, for example, every and kind of nation state or nation alliance set like EU will have different kind of beliefs or values they're trying to ensure through regulation. But even in the United States, for example, there's different states have different laws about, say, facial recognition, right? And so there's a really interesting patchwork of privacy that people need to be more and more aware of, especially as people hold private information. And then finally, it's like, how do you actually adjust and understand over time? Because one of the beliefs we have inside the core ML team is that all development, right? If we think about any type of development that's going to go on in the future, it's not just about heuristic code-based approaches anymore, but like everything is going to integrate some type of non-deterministic system or a system that tries to learn the rules through the data that's available to it. And I think this changes not only how do we monitor these types of systems, but how do we create these like virtuous loops, not just for growth, but actually for understanding that we're still solving people's problems in a way that's valuable to them. And so I think those are some things that will start to happen over time that need to have better understanding of like how we use information, because there will, if we start to detect, like in the language of like machine learning, we start to detect drift of the way that this model's been trained and the way that the model acts versus the way the real world is actually working. That can cause really adverse impacts, not only to like the business model of the organization, but probably more importantly, like actually the end customers and the way that they go about their daily lives and how we fit into those lives in some way. So those are like practices that I think will change over time, especially when people are more oriented around this combining of all of these different aspects of their product into one kind of strategy and understanding of the world.
And what we usually try and understand from founders of startups is what sort of challenges they face when they're trying to drive the culture of growth or try and adopt PLC in itself. But what would be some of the challenges that you think people face in the bigger corporates, having known that product marketing managers ideally would be responsible to drive that culture of growth?
Yeah, this is the problem, is that when in a startup as well, like job titles matter much less, right? Because I've done at least one startup. I would say one official startup. I would say there are a lot of like side projects that I've done that never turned into startups or never really ended up getting like any traction where we were getting paid. But there's this idea of, it's called negotiated joining is the terminology, but it's about how do you actually learn through iteration? What is valuable for you to do on a team? And so I think product managers have to do this because, yeah, there's probably like some basic artifacts that product managers help with. And there's basic artifacts that they work with, say, product marketing managers on, say, go-to-market type of things. But every team needs a slightly different variation of that, right? Because there's a bunch of people that are already there. There's a culture that's already there. There's different people that may be working together that have different strengths. And so that kind of negotiated joining of, let me try this. Does this help the team or not? And then saying, okay, this helps the team, so it becomes part of my responsibility. Or this doesn't help the team, so it's not part of my responsibility, and I stop doing it. So there's something really interesting about that. And that's why I've been trying to get closer. One of the things that I don't think we do as good a job around is actually like go to market for some of, not only for like our open source tools, right? Like we have a really great developer relations group, but just internally, like how do people adopt our tools inside of Google is something that I've been thinking about more. And so I'm working closer and closer with those product marketing managers to see how do we build that linkage and that kind of connective tissue between the role of the product manager and the PMM within that world. As far as like ownership goes, I think this is definitely something that is really tricky because it's not tricky in that as long as you have established role profiles, usually it's pretty straightforward to say, especially large corporations will have like a ladder or a role profile that you should adhere to. And here's your responsibilities. Here's this other person's responsibilities. I don't necessarily Rossi charts and things like that, because I feel like the moment that you do one of those, it's out of date. Usually it's more the exercise that matters, right? It's like, how are we talking about the way we should work with each other? What are our expectations about working with each other? That's the discussion that should happen, rather than we're going to create some super formalized document that will really only be used later on to spank you when you haven't done the right thing, basically. Like, it's the same thing even with like role profiles. Like, I've rarely seen a role profile be used to be like, yeah, this person definitely deserves a promotion. It's usually been like, you do not fit this one thing, and so you're not going to get the promotion until you fix this. So I bristle at the non-human versions of this type of thing. And so what's most important to me is just having good conversations, lots of good work that we do together. That is how we actually end up creating not only the artifacts that our jobs are supposed to create, but also how does that actually just help the team do a better job? And so I'm very much a people-oriented process person. And sometimes it's okay that we just come up with a process on the fly because it makes sense. But if we keep on doing a process over and over again, or we have to keep on deciding what process to do, but we find that one type of process fits most of the time this thing, we should then establish that as some type of process. I think, though, that people will jump to that process step too fast and too early a lot of the times. And that is maybe part of my job, is just for either my VP of product that has an idea about how a process should work, right? Or the peers that I have, they're like directors of product that want to figure out process for their team. My recommendation is usually not to adopt a new process and to just like experiment with something first. So I think that's another thing that we do. And maybe I feel like I'm maybe getting a bit off topic here, but I think there's something really valuable about how you work between a product marketing manager and a product manager. I think ends up being negotiated a lot of the time. And as it should be, we should figure out how to work best with all of the brilliant people that we have on our team.
Yeah. Totally, especially knowing that something that is being adopted for the first time in the organization, how do you get buy-in from multiple stakeholders? And coming to the most critical question of all, Chris, what does the future look like for product-led growth as a way to scale businesses? And how do you see it evolving over the coming years?
Yeah, I don't want to be that person that says machine learning is going to change a lot of these things, but I do honestly believe that it's a evolution of the paradigm of how we actually build products. And I think there's a lot of positive things that could come out of this, right? Like you can understand more easily, not just like from behavioral information that you may be collecting already. I think there's a lot of interesting things that start to happen with machine learning being fully integrated with these systems, especially when we talk about like true personalization or adoption of interfaces to particular people. Even all the things that are going on right now with ChatGPT and this kind of reemergence for maybe the fifth time about chatbots, right? I've lived through a couple companies that have tried to do this previously, so I'm naturally skeptical of it right now. But I think there's something really valuable about people being able to use human language to do something with a computer, whereas before required specialty interfaces or specialization. And there's like a weird or interesting aspect of this, which is to be able to be a good programmer, right? Like you need to basically be as unambiguous as possible in what you write. Because if you're too ambiguous, you'll get lots of like functionality that you didn't expect. And that's considered to be a bad thing when it comes to heuristic-based programming. But if we get to this point where maybe ambiguity is good in certain ways, but there's a way that we translate through understanding context, ambiguity into something that can then be ran by a computer, I think that opens up a lot of possibility that we didn't have before. And so I think what that says to me is even this idea of trying to build systems, right, is no longer, I think once we make it so that humans can actually talk to these systems or work with systems in a way that is not highly technical, it means that we can start to do things like when we talk about targeting. We want to target a particular population of people. Generally, you have to use things like demographic, or there's other types of things that you have to do. When the reality is like you want to talk about what is the type of person that would actually gain value from this. They'll have this type of problem, or it will look like this type of signal, but not this other one. And so this idea is almost like you have a big block of marble that you're like, segmentation is now carving off big pieces of this marble and finding little niches and getting in detail, but it's through a conversation and it's through a more human interaction than it is something that is, I have to overly specify all of the different like little triangles in this like 3D model of the actual statues. So I think that's maybe an analogy I think is going to be interesting. And all of that ends up creating this like, how do we build loops? Because I don't think a lot of people that have previously shipped software, I've worked on software that was shipped on a CD-ROM or web services or something like that. But a lot of the time it's about how do we build this like loop? And in machine learning, there's like loops within loops. So it's not just say a training step, but also this idea of a training loop for an experiment. And then the overall loop is really this like end to end. We've pushed a model to the world, we're monitoring how it's doing, and now we discover something new about the world, and we have to now create another model that will help with that. I think doing a better job of figuring out that loop overall means that we can continue to do a better and better job of servicing the customer that we actually think we should be servicing. It also means that we can understand better and better who is our actual customer, right? Who out of all these different people that are on our site are actually the people that are most likely to be the best customer for us in some way. And so I think those things will start to evolve over time, especially as machine learning I think gets easier to some extent to integrate with these types of things. And that's part of the job is of our team is right now it's very hard. And you have to cobble together a bunch of stuff to be able to use machine learning. But I think longer term, just making these parts of the systems that you're going to be building, I think is really interesting. And I would not go as far as saying like I've always been cagey about the no code, low code type of world because it still requires a lot of disambiguation and unambiguous commands. But I think once we start to allow for more ambiguity, but with safeguards, because that's the other problem we're seeing with these types of things is that it can go like way off like the path you want it to go in some way. So there's something interesting about the development of these tools, and that's something our team is working on to be able to allow for ambiguity in humans to translate to something that is safe and good to be run as a computer or as a program in some way. So that's what I would say.
Yeah, that's very insightful and helps us understand the role that technology, like artificial intelligence and machine learning, will play in the future of product-led growth as well. And
yeah, and one thing I would just add here is that like all technology really basically intermediates humans.
Right.
And so I did talk about this before at a couple different conferences, but there's always like another person that you're interacting with somewhere in the world, right? It's just that we end up drawing the box, the framing for the product manager too narrow to just see that one thing. And so I think that's like another aspect that we need to continue to be aware of, even with the machine learning stuff, is that there's still this like, it's just an intermediation between multiple people working with each other in some way.
Yeah. At the end, it is still serving human needs.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And I always like to sign off with a question that is specifically going to help our listeners. As a product growth thought leader yourself, what are some of the resources, podcasts, books that you would recommend our audience to go through if they're interested in learning more about PLG?
Yeah, I mean, I read an awful lot of Medium articles, 80% of which are not very helpful. But I think getting exposure to lots and lots of different like methodologies, frameworks, processes, I think is really helpful because you can then start to cobble together your own kind of practice, right? So I think that's important. I think everything around complexity theory, like complex adaptive systems, complexity, are things that if you can learn that, I think you do much better in kind of the complexity and ambiguity of the world. And so you could go very academic, which would be like the Santa Fe Institute has some really interesting online courses about like complexity theory. But if you wanted to do things, there's a lot of different groups that end up, I just took this course, Complexity Inside and Out, which is run by some, and I can send you the link for it afterwards, but it's like a course that really talks about not only like how do you internally deal with complexity, but what is this bridge to the outside kind of systems and then how systems deal with complexity. And so those are frameworks like Cynefin. There's a bunch of things, other things that are out there. But I think this idea of like getting used to complexity practice, I think ends up meaning that you're going to like understand and build things that are much more adept to the world as it is today. And as we get more and more connected in all these different ways, complexity is just the reality of the world. It's no longer something that is simple and straightforward. And all the simple and straightforward problems have already been solved. Right. So now the things that are hard to do and interesting and like muddy and thorny problems, as a lot of people will call them, is all because if we can understand them through the lens of complexity, I think they become more understandable and it's easier to then understand. Like a interesting framework I use is by originally just like an educator, which is like what, so what, now what? And it's what is the situation? So what is like, why does it matter to us? And then now what are we going to try? And if you do that, it's every other loop in the world, right? Build, measure, learn, OODA, like all these things end up being like frameworks for just like, how do you approach the world and then iterate on top of it? And so I think that's why complexity is interesting to me, is it's like a way to parse this stuff in the world in some way.
It's been a real pleasure having you on the podcast, Chris. Really appreciate you taking on the time today and sharing your insights with us.
No, thank you for having me. And I'm always happy to connect on LinkedIn if people are interested in talking about this. And then I will be doing a bunch of talks and about kind of operations and product management and strategy and things like that. So I'd always love to connect to people.
I'll make sure to link you on our posts. So thank you so much once again, Chris. You have a great day ahead.
Thank you.